you had introduced the regulations around copyright law. I'm curious about a couple of aspects of that. Specifically, the EU passed copyright reform a couple of years ago, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, what has been the effect of that over the last few years, and what's happening either similar or kind of in response to that in the US regulatory landscape?
Yeah, so I mean, Europe introduced what is called the European Copyright Directive, which was replacing what they called the e-commerce directive, which is very, very similar to other acronym DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is somewhat known in US. It all started with, again, other acronym, with WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, which is an organization below UN. I don't have to hopefully explain what UN is, but it's United Nations. So UN started this organization called WIPO. WIPO is responsible for intellectual property. For instance, they to this date run arbitration for domain disputes. So if you buy a domain and someone steals it from you or something similar, that's the arbiter that you go to negotiate globally any domain issues. So WIPO introduced in 90s law into a lot of the member states, member countries, including the United States, that essentially was trying to protect this fledgling thing called the web. The idea was essentially the music and movie studios were the big dogs in the room, and there will be no innovation in the internet if everything was essentially owned by someone else, right? So like, how would you do news if you cannot use any material, right? So stuff like that. So they introduced, or they suggested this law, and then US transposed that suggestion into what is called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, which was signed by Bill Clinton in 98. And that became the basis for almost all internet that we know today, right? So that's how Wikipedia, YouTube, TikTok, and everything else is able to function in this current in the current world. What happened over the years, so European Union enacted exactly the same thing, or almost exactly the same thing. They called it the e-commerce directive in 2000. So US and EU, and then the rest of the world kind of adopted similar logical laws. The interesting thing is also what people most don't realize is US biggest export is entertainment. And part of that is in all of the deals that they make. So any deal that US makes with any country in the world, part of that deal always is the fact that the country has to follow the US copyright law. Every single country, I mean, I'm literally outside of maybe North Korea, Iran, and a few others, every single country in the world accepted and agreed to the fact that US copyright law applies everywhere. So there is only technically two significant bodies of laws. There is the European law and there is the US law. Europe also has very similar structure, where Europe requires that you follow the laws that they essentially have for copyright. It's very common part of the negotiation. So Europe in 2012-13 started really getting antsy around data protection and started really focusing on that, and that resulted in GDPR, as we know. The funny thing about copyright is essentially a different side of the coin of the data, right? So what we call the privacy data or privacy protection of data, it's what is unintentionally created data, right? So you click this button on Facebook, right? Copyright is what we call an intentionally created data. Like, I wanted to create this image. It didn't happen by just randomly clicking, right? But it's technically, the logic is the same, right? It's data, protected. So what EU started doing and started looking at is essentially we wanted to protect these fledgling companies called Google and YouTube and others from the big dogs in the room, movie studios, music studios, and so. However, over 20 years, the tables turned significantly, and we cannot get any media essentially to be started because these large companies take advantage. So they looked at these laws and said, we don't believe that this is suitable anymore. And they suggested a new process which requires outright licenses prior publishing. And they looked at this from technological perspective, how could that work, and blah, 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 and ultimately agreed that this is possible. And so 2019, they adopted the law. Polish government sued in the European Court of Justice, saying that this is essentially challenging the freedom of rights. They eventually lost last year, and then European Union started pushing on those laws. So they, for the first time, really started doing something about it for the last couple of months, and they just sued 11 member states for not transposing that law. And so that's kind of the first step. So I will say, really similarly to GDPR, within the next 2 years or so, we will see quite significant progress from the European Union, especially from the European Commission, on this topic. And then in US, since '98, since the DMCA, not really much changed until I will say maybe 2-3 years ago, when Senator Tillis and a few others on the Republican side started really paying attention, started having kind of the same arguments as the European Commission, and started introducing new laws or new suggestions. And so Senator Tillis introduced last year what is called the SMART Act, or Smart Copyright Act, which is trying to bring the US law closer to the European structure. And that is going through, I believe, House within the next few weeks. And so US will come closer to this. China, surprisingly, one of the most copyright infringing countries in the world, is now adopting very strenuous, very, very strong copyright laws, because the top companies that were the biggest infringers, from Tencent, Baidu, and others, are now the largest rights holders in the world. And so Tencent owns 20% of UMG, Universal Music, 2% of Warner. They own 10% of Spotify, and all sorts of other companies. And so to them, copyright is now kind of one of the most primary ways how to protect their own assets. And so China is turning very rapidly from essentially the biggest infringer in the world to the complete opposite. Essentially, they are forcing the population to follow the rules very, very strongly. And then Russia is kind of going in the opposite way, especially since the war with Ukraine started. They suspended copyright law completely. So it's a free for all. Obviously, Russia is kind of on the fringes
Just
of everything.
out of spite.
Out of spite, yes. But
so if Senator Tilly's suggestion is passed, what will change practically?
It introduces only one change to the law. It is a super specific. It has something to do with what is called standard technical measure. That standard technical measure already exists in the original DMCA law, and that idea behind it was, over time, all of these companies will develop standards of technical standard that will be used, right? And then the standard technical measure will enforce that standard. So meaning, instead of saying, here is the entity that will decide what the standard is, they hope that the industry will create a standard itself and then propagate it through each other, right? That never happened. That said, YouTube did create a standard. In fact, our business is very much inspired by what they created. We may have gotten further and did a little bit different things, but ultimately it is the standard that it's coming from. And what the Senator Tillis' suggestion is, it's putting the decision making away from, or taking it away from the companies and putting it to the Copyright Office. So under Library of Congress, there is an entity called Copyright Office, and that is responsible for arbitration of copyright laws and or copyright lawsuits and such, and enforcement copyright laws. But part of this is going to be they will be essentially the arbiter also of the standard technical measure. And then standard technical measure is explicitly what is supposed to be the standard of technology that you have to use, right? The minimum standard. So this is very similar to financial industry, where they have KYC and AML. KYC is the know your customer, and this is where they identify you, right? It's standard. If you want to build a fintech company of any kind, this is a requirement that will have. So what they are trying to essentially say is, like, if you want to build a UGC platform of any kind, this is the requirement you have, right? And that's what they're trying to get. And that requirement is closer to what we are kind of building, and that's what they're trying to push forward.
Got it. Does Section 230 have anything to do with this? Section 230 often comes in and out of the news cycle in waves, because whenever the platforms are getting negative publicity, everybody's talking about repealing 230, and now with ChatGPT, it's come back, and that's an interesting conversation. But does that have anything to do with the copyright laws as it relates to what you're doing, or it's a different topic?
It does not. It's a part of the Telecommunication Decency Act. It's older than the copyright law, at least the modern copyright law. It applies to speech. So it is really interesting the distinction that we made as a humans, because, for instance, an Instagram picture is a copyright, but Instagram comment is a speech. While logically both are copyright and both are speech at the same time, right? It's like it doesn't really make any sense to distinguish them in any way, but we somehow, as a humanity, as a society, at least the US society, decided that there will be the distinction between these. And so the Section 230 explicitly focuses on a kind of an intent. And what most people don't understand really is what Section 230 actually really does is saying, because someone moderates something doesn't mean they have to moderate everything or that they cannot moderate anything, right? And so it literally just creates an interesting situation for the platforms where it says, yes, you can choose to moderate some parts without being considered an editorial company, right? So like New York Times, there's literally no section that is not editorialized, including their ads, right? Everything goes through the same kind of lens. On Facebook, what this Section 230 means, if they have a billion posts a day, they can pick one post and moderate that post. And that's all they can do. And the law says if you don't moderate everything, then you are not editorial company. And that means you benefit from the copyright laws protections like the MCA that exist. Because, for instance, New York Times doesn't, right? So New York Times is not protected by DMCA because it's all editorialized, right? And so Section 230, in fact, is a fantastic law that protects the people that actually call for the repeal are protected more by it than the ones that don't. So it's really funny how people misunderstand it, and as a consequence, that will hurt much more if it was repealed. But somehow, you know how this is. Like, people really don't care about the core of anything. They just care about the idea of it. And it's the one thing that will change. For instance, platforms like Glassdoor are not currently responsible for what people post, right? So if someone says you're a complete liar and I don't think you should be running this company, there's nothing you can do. You cannot delete it and you cannot fight it, right? These kind of platforms, from Yelp to everything else, will go away if Section 230 doesn't exist, because they will have liability with the content. And so this gives them some opportunity to protect themselves.